Welcome everyone to this, our 80th version of the Canadian Association Club of Rome Zoom series. We are dedicated to intelligent debate and of course, action on global issues. Today we have Dr. Ian Burton, an independent scholar and professor emeritus at the U of T, University of Toronto, where he, of course, was the director of institutional, or the Institute of Environmental Studies and a professor of the Department of Geography and Planning. He's, of course, been an advisor to the Canadian government and has participated in a number of UNFCCC forums, COPs, and has been involved as a lead author on 3 IPCC assessments. His research is focused on human adjustment to natural hazards, i.e. adaptability, as well as environmental risk and disasters. The plan here is that he will talk for about 15-20 minutes and about his involvement at COP26, whereupon we will have a conversation later or following, and in fact everyone will be encouraged to participate in this. And with that, Ian, I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Art, and thank you to CACOR, and very great pleasure to be here and amongst you and to share some of my reactions and feelings to the 26th Conference of the Parties to the Framework Convention on Climate Change. I attended this with a badge of admission from the University of Toronto, which is a participating organization, which is allowed to nominate observers. And so I was nominated, and I paid for myself in my own way. I had some questions about whether one should go to such meetings and increase emissions from flights and so on, and managed to convince myself that on balance, I should go and make whatever contributions I could, both there and in terms of sharing and promoting the issues of climate change and their solution. First, a little bit about the conference itself. There are, I think, various estimates of over 30,000 people attended, not all at the same time. Accommodation was very difficult to find. 3 classes of people, I suppose you might say. There were the delegates, who members of official delegations, then a very large number of people who were observers, and I was in that category, which meant that I could go around and go to all the many side events and panels and discussions, but was not allowed into the inner negotiations. But I could talk to the people that I know on delegations. Elizabeth May was on the Canadian delegation. I have a very good friend, Salim Hook from Bangladesh, who was on the Bangladesh delegation, and a number of others. And of course, I have a lot of old friends from COP meetings, because I've been going since COP1 in Berlin in 1995, was it? So not to all of them, but to many of them. The delegates were divided into 2 groups in the way each national delegation had the inner group, which was really engaged in the negotiations. Then there were other members of the delegation who could sit in and watch, but who were not really part of the negotiations in detail. And then there were so many different observer organizations. You could almost name any NGO in the world, and there was some representation. So the Red Cross and organizations representing women and disadvantaged people and disabled people and indigenous people, and of course the fossil fuel industry and many others. Quite a circus in that sense. And then with the outsiders, the demonstrators, the Greta Thunberg people and many others who demonstrated in the main streets of Glasgow, especially on the middle weekend, but couldn't get anywhere near the actual conference itself. Beside the negotiations, there were so many side events, and I participated in a few of those, mostly focused on adaptation and coping with the impacts of climate change and trying to diminish the future impacts. The whole outcome was encapsulated in this document, which I think has been circulated, called Decision CP26, the Glasgow Climate Pact. And you might well ask, what is a pact? Well, we had the Paris Agreement, which carried some ideas of what we should achieve and to some extent how they should achieve them. And this was supposed to be a step along the implementation where people nations reported what they've been doing, and we could have some sense of how far we're getting towards the resolving or solving or living with or whatever. I went in with a very low expectation based on past experience, and came out a little bit surprised by the positive wish list and tone that you can see reflected in that climate change pact. But of course, they're all there's no real commitment that is punished or some adverse effect occurs if you don't live up to your promises. So there are a lot of words. If you read the first word, notes with serious concern, emphasizes the urgency, welcomes the national, urges parties, notes with concern, recognize the importance of, welcomes, pledges, on and on and on. But none of them are really sort of say, we undertake to do this by this and such a date, and if we don't, we'll suffer these adverse consequences. Nothing very serious. So it is quite possible to understand what Greta Thunberg means when she says blah blah blah. But the sense of sort of commitment, and if it was on promises, and even if it was blah blah blah, there was a lot of it. So there was some sort of sense of direction, which was and perhaps a stronger sense of direction than I'd anticipated. So in one sense, it left me a little bit more optimistic than the low expectations that I went in with. But on balance, I came out with a very, very pessimistic and not very hopeful notion about the future, both from what I heard and saw the outcome of the negotiations and from the conversations and panel discussions and so on that went on the side. So it left me with some thoughts, and I thought I would put these in terms of questions rather than my answers. So if you'll put up with me for a while, I will give you a list of 12 questions, and then so perhaps we can pick up on some of those questions, and I don't think we need to take them in any necessary order. But since I'm talking to members of the Club of Rome in Canada, my first question is, remember the limits to growth and what was limits to growth? The report many years ago for the Club of Rome. What has happened since? And have we avoided the limits to growth, or have we just pushed them down the road? What is it we meant by limits anyway? Secondly, are we now at the limits, and is climate change the final and unavoidable limit to growth? Well, third question, perhaps not if we can get off fossil fuels. Can we get off fossil fuels? How soon and how rapidly? And what will happen if we do so by 2050, as is promised, as said as the target? We will be carbon neutral by 2050. That doesn't mean no emissions. It means that we'll absorb some of the carbon or do some things that reduce carbon at the same time as we continue at a much lower level to increase carbon emissions, but not stop them altogether. So what will happen in the event of that very slow reduction of emissions by carbon neutral by 2050? Fourth question, can we achieve that anyway? Global temperature has increased already from the early beginnings of the industrial era, let's say approximately 1800, has increased by a global mean surface temperature of 1.1 degrees centigrade. And the aim of the Paris Agreement is to keep that increase to 2 degrees, or an more ambitious target of 1.5. And indeed, the IPCC says that there's a huge difference between 1.5 and 2. Can we achieve that limit of 2 degrees? Well, we've made present commitments, question 5, and these commitments that the countries voluntarily make, they're nationally determined commitments, and each country has said how rapidly it will reduce its emissions down to 2050. When you take those commitments and you add them up, because they were supposed to be reported, and many of them have been, but not all of them, when you add all those commitments up, they lead to an increase of 2.4 degrees by or even before 2050. But the question here is, will countries even keep those commitments? Because we've seen in many other cases where promises have been made under the Framework Convention, but they've not been kept. Countries have made small steps in that direction, but they failed actually to keep them. So when we say, will countries keep these commitments, it is a question. So what do these commitments really mean? They are nationally determined contributions, and there are no sanctions for their failure to reach them other than moral sanctions and moral suasion. My question 7 is, if each country makes its own decisions, it makes those decisions in terms of its own national interest and not as in terms of what is good for humanity or for the world or for the globe as on a whole. So is what we are dealing with a sort of tragedy of the global commons? Each country does what its own short-term best interest, and let the world go to hell, as so we see. So, and that's a function of the present system of global governance. We don't have agreements with sanctions. Well, not in the environmental area, although we do in the trade area, because there are trade commitments and there are trade agreements and trade. So if you don't conform to that, there is a challenge, and there are sanctions in the case of some of the trade agreements. We don't have that in climate or other environmental agreements. So can we change this system of global governance with respect to climate change, such that there are firm agreements and sanctions for the failure to keep them? Does that mean some sort of reform of the UN system? How could you possibly do that? And aren't we in fact going in the opposite direction, where we're moving towards self-interested and populist governments? Well, then there is the other side of the technological solutions. Can we rely on technology? Hydrogen sources of power, wind and solar, nuclear, geothermal, carbon capture and storage, geoengineering. and all the potential new ideas that are being thought about, and to which money, in some cases substantial amounts of money, is being put by governments, including the US government, massive investments in looking at these alternative technologies as a way of escape. So is there a technology way out of this? Massively improved battery storage, lots of technological options. And if you think about the calls of limits to growth, have we not postponed those limits to growth by the application of technology? And cannot we continue to do that in the case of climate change? So how do we factor into that the self-interest of the corporate world protecting its current investments? Well, protecting its current investments leads the corporate world, especially the fossil fuel industry, to delay these changes and not to promote them rapidly, and only adopt them when bit by bit when they determine it's possible and necessary to do so. But in addition to investments in the alternative technologies, there is a lot of public interest in this. Corporations are beginning to invest more. Their boards and their members, holders of their investments, are asking corporations to now report the extent to which they are at risk from climate change, the extent to which their business might be adversely affected, and what they are doing to protect themselves from this. So there is a balance. Government is going the wrong way with populism. We're investing in technology, but at the same time making very slow incremental changes in the right direction. And my last question, Ray, is something that was not publicly debated in Glasgow, but which was underlying and which was spoken a lot about in the observer community and in the corridor talk. And that was the notion of what is being called climate justice. So can we not only resolve this problem, but resolve it in a just and fair way? And one of the labels for this in the outcome of the in the pact was reference to loss and damage. So loss and damage is a sort of indicator for knowing how much is being lost, permanently lost, and how much is ongoing damage from climate change, which has been evident for some time and is likely to continue and increase for some considerable time. Who is responsible for that loss and damage? Well, you could say the carbon emitters, but the carbon emitters are, who are they? Well, the biggest emitters in the world now are the United States and China. But if you say to China is responsible for the loss and damage, they say, oh no, because we are a very recent arrival on the scene in the United States, and other richer industrialized countries have been putting carbon out for 200 years. So carbon dioxide out for 200 years. So it's not just the present emitters, it's the cumulative emissions over time, which should be considered. And then others say, yes, but actually it's not just total emissions, it's responsibility also has an element of per capita emissions. And there you would find that Canada is amongst the worst, because while our emissions in the global total are less than 2%, we are amongst the highest of the populations in the world in terms of our per capita emissions. So if you say, well, loss and justice, we have to figure out who's responsible and how much are we responsible, and how will that be allocated, and what could possibly be an agreed system of climate justice. And perhaps one could also go on to say that is an example of global justice in many, many other areas. And we have a system now in which is globally totally unjust, and it's not being addressed. In fact, we are, if anything, moving away from that, or certainly not approaching it with any degree of concern or severity. But a lot of technological change, including social media and other changes that have enhanced communication and given a sense of global unity, and the massive nature of problems that are being manifested now at a global level do require some rethinking. So some people say, yes, well, we are moving towards a state of some big transformation has to occur to deal with these situations, beginning with climate change, perhaps, but the COVID pandemic is another example, and there are many other examples that you could imagine. So a big transformation, and how could that transformation be brought about? And if we don't make the transformation, then do we hit those limits? Do we come to some apocalypse? And I think these were the sort of questions that were in the minds of the Meadows and others who wrote that Limits to Growth report so many years ago, but which are still there, and they're still very much on the agenda, perhaps formulated in different ways, but nevertheless pressing, and something that members of the Club of Rome and its successor organizations need perhaps to think about. So I've talked a little bit beginning with Glasgow and climate change, and I've broadened this out to the global quantum of the moment, and tried to express this in terms of questions rather than answers. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. What we're for those who have just joined us, you can turn your video on, and I ask you to apply a little bit of management on your audio, because dogs bark and people start talking, the phones ring, etc. I do have one comment from Ralph Torrey, which I think is worthwhile having him address it. He's saying that standard assets are a signature of grand transitions, and I'm sure he can add more to that. Do you want to go ahead with that, Ralph?
Well, thanks, Art. I mean, it was just an observation in response to one of the questions Ian had raised about corporate interests and how they'll be affected by this. And the observation is just that when you look back at the transformative and disruptive transitions, whether it was the automobile or the internet or whatever, invariably stranded assets are present, and to the point where it occurs to me that they're almost like a signature. If you don't see stranded assets, it's probably not that big a transition that's underway. That's all. Not a particularly profound observation, but
okay. John Mayer, do you want to go ahead with your comment?
Ian, I went over your notes. I think there were 7 pages of notes. And in those, the word finance was mentioned 22 times. Capacity was mentioned 10 times. Price was mentioned 0, and cost was mentioned 0. And I think that the only way to manage investment, we've had a real problem managing, trying to get public sector and private sector investment going. And I think the only way to hit the kind of targets we need to is to assure a price range for energy. Price range, prices for fossil fuels have to go up, and go up consistently. And they have to be predictable if you're going to manage investment properly. Same with electricity costs and whatever tariffs are paid to various types of renewable energy. They have to go up, but they don't have to go up as quickly. I think all energy is going to be going up. So I see the way to kickstart, or the way to assure that the massive investment we need to make from all parties, individuals, communities, energy companies, governments, etc. They have to have a confidence of a certain price regime. Otherwise, it doesn't happen. In the last, what was it, 2011, when gas went up to $1.50, I lived in truck country, still live in truck country now. Almost everywhere is truck country, and everybody was talking about downsizing. Price does matter, and especially if they know it's not coming down. When prices dropped again, we went back to big vehicles and we stopped caring. So what do you have to say about price, essentially establishment of energy pricing ranges?
And
I'm tempted to answer a question with another question. Yes, how would you bring that about? I think that the Glasgow Climate Pact that you referred to is full of nice ideas and wishful thinking, but there's practically nothing really in the way of serious implementation. How do you actually go about doing that? Except you just pass the buck to nation states or the private sector and tell them, this is where we're going, please get on the bus, please join the train. But very little in the way of precise steps for implementation. Do you agree with that? Is that the question you're raising?
There's national prices and there's international prices. If you raise if one nation raises its prices to the internal domestic market, and it has any kind of export component or manufacturing sectors which compete with other countries, and other countries don't raise their prices, then you're going to see the local sectors being eviscerated, just as manufacturing in most of the Western world was eviscerated when presented with competition from China with very cheap energy, very low environmental regulation, very low labor standards and low wages, and you can't allow that to happen. So prices have to be either countries decouple themselves significantly from world markets and try and become more self-sufficient, which I think has to happen anyway, or there's got to be some international recognition that the only way investment happens is if prices are fairly predictable and higher. And that might be a component that, rather than saying cutting carbon, the general term of cutting carbon, if you become much more specific and say energy, let's agree on a price regime that's going to allow us to hit the investment we need to cut carbon. So that's basically what I'm saying. We've agreed on the large problem. Now we have to get down to the nuts and bolts of how it's going to be implemented.
Is there an economist in the room who would be better able to respond to that than myself?
Rick Carpenter, do you want to take a swing at that?
Art. John, Art?
Yes. Go ahead.
John Myers just articulated a routine political and economic thinking. That's what's been driving our society for a long time. But if you want to deal with something which is a really serious issue, there are more tools in the government's box than pricing. Just think about lead. The neurological effects of lead, when they were thoroughly understood, governments didn't put an extra tax on lead. They made other arrangements. Tetraethyl lead in gasoline, same thing. It was simply outlawed. When DDT's effects were understood, and Elizabeth May had a lot to do with this, no, we did not tax organochlorines, we eliminated them. Same with sulfur dioxide, the substances which deplete the ozone layer. So price, yes, but just think about the purchase of gasoline for vehicles. About 18 months ago, the price of a litre of regular gas in Ottawa was about 70 cents. In the last few months, it's been roughly $1.40. So I asked my neighbor, okay, how much more gasoline were you buying back 18 months ago, or turn it the other way around? Are you buying less gasoline now than you did 18 months ago when the price was 1/2? And the answer is no, we don't care about the price. We need it. It's so useful. So my observation is maybe in the business world, it's not the same thing. There's a concept which you never read about in conventional governmental or economic thinking in Canada, and that's price elasticity. If you go to the United States, you can find data on price elasticity at the Energy Information Administration. We unfortunately don't have any equivalent one. And the price elasticity for regular gasoline in the United States is about minus 0.04, which means it's essentially inelastic. So yes, John, prices do matter in some senses, but we're dealing with an existential issue here. And I submit one has to look at the technological reasons that we're in this pickle and the technological reasons which may get us out. And sure, pricing can be part of that. But pricing on its own, faced with this issue, in my view, is totally useless.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not suggesting pricing on its own. I'm suggesting that it's part of it. Certainly, you have to have standards. You have to set standards, and that's why I'm bringing it up. But investment has to involve price. And if you're investing money, you've got to have an idea of what you're getting back. And if you happen to be producing electricity from windmills, and the price drops, demand drops because gasoline goes to 4 cents a liter, then your situation becomes untenable. So I think it has to be a package, but certainly not price alone. Standards have to be involved, but price is important for certain investment decisions, and we've got to get investment teed up.
I rather like Ralph Torrey's assessment of this that says we're really interested in comfort and doing the social things which we do rather than really being terribly concerned about the price of the fuel. And maybe Ralph could address that better than I. But I sign up to that, which says, and which supports, of course, what John Holland said, that we're interested in comfort and convenience. And if the price of fuel goes up, that you can complain about it, but you're not going to change your habits. Your habits win.
Yeah, electricity can provide just as much comfort as gasoline. If it just requires a change in sourcing of your energy. Okay. Anyway, I've used up a lot of time.
Rick Carpenter, were you going to say something?
Yes, I was just going to say something, and then I would like to suggest that we take John McClintock into this discussion, because I've been reading his most recent paper, and I think he will have plenty to say on this. The one word that I haven't heard, although John Meyer was hinting at it, is alternatives. If we have alternatives to gas-powered locomotion, we will go to them if they are less expensive. And you're an example of that, Art, with your lovely car. And if we have good public transport, I'm sure many people would prefer to use that than to have to carry the cost of owning a car. At any rate, back to you, Art.
Okay, let's kind of change the topic a little bit here. Unless, Ralph, did you want to make a comment on this?
Well, simply to support what John said, the elasticity of energy commodity prices varies over a huge range. If you're running a steel mill or an industrial chemical plant, it's pretty large contribution to your costs. But if you're in general manufacturing, or even if you're in the business of freight transport, it's not a dominant cost. And in a lot of our day-to-day activities, it's even a smaller contributor to the provision of the fundamental amenity that is really what people, what consumers are looking for, whether it be comfort or information or recreational experiences and so on. And so this is why simplistic statements about the price of energy commodities are not that helpful at this point, because, and I'm glad to see that there seems to be a strong consensus that by itself, price is not a particularly sharp or effective instrument for addressing this emergency. And related to this, on the question of alternatives, absolutely, but how we define alternatives, and this all the former physics students in the room will appreciate. How you solve a problem is largely determined by the way you identify the boundary conditions and the alternatives that we will see. It's a much longer list if you define the problem to include the provision of amenity and not just substitutes for this or that energy commodity. And so alternative ways of providing comfort, or all these other things that I mentioned a moment ago, come into the picture in a big way. They'll come in anyway, because innovation does that. And it's one of the things that has saved us from this problem being a lot worse, a lot sooner already, is that many of the innovations, trends that we've seen, whether it be the internet, whether it be telepresence technologies, are having the effect of substituting new types of innovation for energy services in the provision of amenity. So this is not just about substituting our current levels of energy commodity consumption with other types of energy commodities. This is about a transformation in the role that energy commodities themselves play in the provision of human amenity.
Okay, Raymond, you had some comment as well on this?
Well, I just wrote that I've been following energy prices and things of that nature for a long time, and it's true that the price of gas does not have much of an impact in the short term, because you've got a vehicle that has a certain consumption that you can't just change at will, right? People change their vehicles over a number of years, not on a daily basis. I remember in the run up to the financial crisis, the price of oil had gone up quite a bit, and I saw many examples where they were showing that the public was starting to choose to purchase cars that were more efficient in terms of fuel consumption. And then after the crisis happened and the price of oil crashed, people went back to buying SUVs and pickup trucks and all that. So there is some elasticity for sure, but it's a long-term thing because you can't substitute your source of energy very easily. And if you look at what economists are saying, they are saying that that carbon pricing is the most effective way of reducing consumption, but it is a very long-term thing, especially when you're looking at industrial processes where investments in plant and equipment are done over periods of returns are realized over a period of decades, right? So but it's clear to me that there is an impact. Price does have an impact, but again, it's not a short-term impact for sure because it's very difficult to change sources.
Okay, good. And John McClintock, did you want to comment on this? You've thought about it quite a bit.
Yeah, I found the questions that you pose, Ian, extremely interesting. But perhaps first of all, could I just ask two very specific points, and that concerns the Glasgow Climate Pact. I looked in there for the phrase tipping point. We heard a lot about tipping points over the last, say, 10 or 15 years, but the term tipping point is not in the pact. Does that mean now that the scientists are not quite so sure that tipping points will actually occur? That's my first technical question. And the other one concerns this reduction of 45% in emissions. Is that is there now a consensus on that amongst the scientific community? So just those 2 points, tipping points and this figure of 45% reduction, which is required by 2050. Is there a consensus amongst the scientists on that figure?
Well, perhaps there are other people that could respond to question number 2 better than I can. I'm not too familiar with the notion of 45% reduction. I've mostly heard this expressed in terms of carbon neutrality by 2050, which means the balance of things that increase carbon and things that reduce carbon, tree planting and so on and so forth, lots of other things. So I don't actually understand, and perhaps others can explain the relationship between carbon neutrality by 2050 and net zero emissions, or and your figure of 45%. The question about tipping points it interests me a lot, and I was looking at that old book from the 1950s or early 60s. What the heck was it called? About the adoption of innovations, and there was a graph or charts showing how innovations creep in slowly, and there are sort of early adopters who take the risk, and then once it gets to that tipping point, there's suddenly a huge rapid increase in the adoption of innovations in an early majority, and then a late majority, and then some laggards who join much later, if at all. So tipping point I don't think was ever mentioned. I don't ever heard it mentioned, but I think it does underlie a lot of the thinking behind the negotiations themselves. So I think that one of the excuses that the negotiators might make for not having identified specific global steps and leaving this to nations is the sense that there is this overall process, and the Framework Convention and the COP conferences, 26 of them, are pointing in the direction, and they're saying this is the way we're going. We've agreed that we're going to do this, and the process will sort of take upon itself a life of its own by the process of reaching, as I think you suggested, a tipping point. So I think it's rather an assumption that underlies it rather than anything that is made explicit. And of course, where does the tipping point lie is a question to which I think that, as I would understand it at the moment, there is no answer, but it lies somewhere when it becomes advantageous in many ways to make the shift that will increasingly reduce either reduce fossil carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gas emissions, or enhance capacity to adapt, respond, reduce vulnerability and exposure on the other side of the coin. I'm not sure if that responds sufficiently to your points.
Well, I have a more general point, and that refers to your question number 8. I think you were mentioning that this system of global governance is not really the system we need, because it doesn't. I mean, nations and governments can make promises, they can make commitments, but there is no sanction if those commitments are not kept. And that's been a feature of the climate negotiations since they began, as far as I can work out.
Yeah.
You know, the Americans rejected the Kyoto Protocol,
Yeah.
and unless you have some sort of global governance system whereby nations are kept to their promises, then it will be a free-for-all. And as you rightly said, it will be a tragedy of the commons, as expressed by Garrett Hardin about 60 years ago. So I'm wondering, my thinking takes me down the route that the countries of Europe have followed over the last 60 years. You know, the European continent was riven with conflict and wars, and these have now come to an end in Europe because the governments subject themselves to supranational law, and that's quite effective because the governments of the governments of the countries in the European Union, they first of all they agree to the law. The law is made by them and the European Parliament. So it's the governments and the European Parliament who make the law, and if the governments don't stick to the law, then they get a hefty financial penalty, you know, running to hundreds of thousands of euro every day. Now, how would you, as a Canadian citizen, but having observed the Europeans, you know, in all these COP meetings, and looking at Europe from your vantage point in Canada, what would you think about some sort of arrangement on a global level, which resembles what the Europeans have managed to construct over the last 60 years with great success?
Yes, I mean, I think it's a wonderful, excellent example and achievement. It's not without its flaws, but it's certainly a great step forward. And I've always been very strongly in support of that development, and hence disgusted with the Brexit move. But when you say how to translate that onto a global scale, yes, ideally I would love to see something of that sort, but I think the nations of the world are far away from that thinking. We are retreating into a more divided, more divisive world, maybe going into a world of power blocks, maybe not a reiteration of the Cold War where there were largely two major powers. Maybe there will be a multiplicity of power blocks, and maybe within those they could come to some sort of not global international but regional international agreements and and step forward. So I would certainly want to endorse the idea and encourage it in principle, but I'm not at all optimistic or hopeful that could be achieved in the short run.
Ian,
Yeah.
can I just point out that you are expressing exactly the same views that were expressed by many, many Europeans in the 1950s.
Oh, all right. Yes.
They said, oh, this idea of a European Union, it's for the birds. We're seeing a division in the whole world.
Yes.
The French are never going to be able to get on with the Germans. So it'll never work. And what happened? Well, there were a few statesmen, they came up with the right design. They came up with a design so that it was in everybody's interest to form a community. And if one can design an arrangement which is in everybody's interest, then I think nations would look at it quite objectively. I mean, how would the Canadians look at such an arrangement?
Well, the big word is if. So I don't want to ruin or discourage the adventure by speaking about it in pessimistic terms. But on the other hand, it is, isn't it, a big if?
Sorry, if what? Sorry.
Well, if the nations of the world could come together and arrive at some system whereby they appreciate their common and mutual benefit.
Well, how would you, as a Canadian, how would you react to such a proposal? How would you?
Yeah, I'm all for it.
Okay.
Could I just add a footnote? Negotiating such a thing with highly imaginative and visionary and committed leading politicians, as happened in Europe, beginning with the European coal and steel community and just having it around that area, that section, and then, with the external support of the United States and the Marshall Plan, rebuilding and reshaping Europe after the end of the Second World War. Yes. There is also the sort of going back to the sort of tipping point argument, because the mutual interest in when something is moving in that direction, there is interest in getting, there is risk in being too early an innovator, but there is also risk in not getting on the board where the world is going soon enough and getting left behind. So I think there is something in the sort of ongoing process which points in that direction as well in the tipping point sense. But good questions to which.
Okay, let's move on. There's Raymond got his hand up, followed by Phil Riley. Go ahead, Ray.
I just want to make a couple of points. I think John was referring more to scientific tipping points in terms of climate change. And yes, the science hasn't changed there. The predictions are becoming more accurate, though. The science is getting better. So there are a number of tipping points that are predicted. But it's looking like if you look at the polar the polar ice cap and it melting, if we melt it beyond a certain point, it'll be very difficult to get it to start freezing again. So there's a bunch of melting points like that tipping points like that exist that the scientists are tracking. Nothing has changed in terms of avoiding those or not. The other point I wanted to make is I think that given the international context and given that it's very difficult to get the Russians, the Chinese, and the Americans on the same page, let alone the India. I think what the real hope that we have is that economics will drive us towards cleaner solutions, and we are seeing that. So if you look at my area of specialty, which is electric vehicles, we're seeing the price of batteries go down, and we're seeing that the electrification of the fleet is starting to happen very fast in Europe, in particular. We're seeing massive increases in market share of EVs, and we're seeing the same thing in the green energy sector, where this is driven by the reduction in prices of batteries, reduction in prices of solar and wind, and it's causing a revolution in the energy markets and in the transportation market. What I think government should do is to accelerate these things that happen because of economic forces. So what do I mean by that? Well, for the electrification of the heavy duty fleet, we need the federal government to put some money into establishing a fleet of charging stations that could be used by heavy duty trucking to recharge their car. Recharge the trucks, right? Right now, there's no chargers that would support those. So we need the government to seed that and to get that going. Same with other areas like using heat pumps to replace natural gas for heating. We need the government to invest more in that, and they are doing that, but even more in increasing the production of these things so that the prices will go down, so that it becomes more affordable to make that transition. So I think that we need the government to try to drive the economics in the direction we need it to go, and the economics should help us get a long way in the right direction.
Okay, any quick comment other than that? Let's move on to Phil. Phil Riley.
Had to unmute myself. Yeah, I'm not very familiar with the people that attend the COP conferences, but I don't ever remember hearing anything about the insurance industry having a major role. And so what I'm thinking of here is that the consequences of not making significant changes to our behavior in terms of causing negative impacts to the environment is probably something that the insurance industry is going to have a big involvement in. So that, you know, if seawater rises to the point that communities are inundated, the insurance industry is going to be asked to pony up. If the food industry, the agricultural industry loses crop production, the insurance industry is going to be asked to pony up. At what point does the insurance industry have a major role of maybe overriding political decision-making and going back to the topic that we've been having here, which is economic? It's going to be economics that drives change.
Anybody want to respond?
There is some movement amongst the reinsurance industries, Munich and Zurich reinsurance industries, to address the climate question, and they've been quite active. There is a center in Bonn, I think, established by the Munich reinsurance company to address and try and answer these questions. Here in Canada, there is also the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction, which is a creation of the Insurance Bureau of Canada, the insurance industry, based here in Toronto, and also with a center in London, Ontario, Western University. They seem to be very focused on sort of individual extreme events and addressing ways where the exposure and vulnerability to those events might be reduced. And of course, you can put qualifiers on the insurance policy about actions that you must take to reduce your own vulnerability or exposure. But there's also been the straight sort of, well, we'll just put up the rates. And I think on the eastern seaboard of the United States, from Florida going north, insurance rates for exposed coastal locations, property in exposed coastal locations, have been put up quite sharply. I don't know how much and by which company. And that has forced some people out of insurance altogether. I mean, the property owners have said, well, that insurance is too high and I'm not going to pay it. And the probability of that hurricane hitting me in such a devastating way, I'll just take that risk. And then, you know, when it happens, I'll bear the loss. Well, I won't actually bear the loss. I'll appeal to the government for help, and the government will bail me out whether I have insurance or not. And then there are other initiatives in the United States. There's a national flood insurance program, which says that with state cooperation, you can that's a whole new program related to floods and encompassing the increase of flood magnitude and probability because of climate change. But the question is right, and I think the insurance industry was one of the private sector groups that began to be addressing climate change, among the first to address it.
So the following question would be, if the insurance industry isn't going to be the one that ponies up, it's going to be the governments.
Yes.
They require increased payment of taxes. That's not a very popular topic.
Well, I mean, that raises a whole other question. All this new monetary theory that's going on, I don't understand it, but people are talking about, you know, the old criterion of debt to GDP ratio doesn't really matter that much anymore. The economists could speak to that, I hope. And so government prints the money so it can just print as much as it likes. And that's what big governments seem to have been doing.
Yeah. Paul Koch, go ahead. You've had your hand up for some time.
Yeah. I was interested in that there seems that these conferences to be no discussion about population growth. And I think most of you know that I attended the Stockholm conference. Here's my Limits to Growth book. And the big question there was the need to work towards zero population growth. Came home and told my wife we weren't going to have the other 2 kids that we were planning on having. She's never forgiven me, I don't think, because she wanted a son, which we had 2 daughters. In any event, you know, in Canada, we pay people to have more kids and we import lots of people to drive our economy forward. And as one of our speakers in the last couple of weeks made pretty clear, in the long run, at some point, the population has to go down rather than keep growing. And it can get there by pandemics, it can get there by planning, it can get there by a variety of means. But I'm surprised there seems to be no discussion about that topic anywhere these days.
I still recommend zombie apocalypse.
Yeah, there's discussion increasingly at the local level to urban expansion. People are fighting urban sprawl, so it's coming in there. Canadians for a Sustainable Society spend a lot of time on population, but it certainly isn't covered in the mainstream media. Toxic topic, and it's commercial death. Population stabilization is commercial death for the most powerful political interests, which are developers, speculators, banks who benefit from development and asset inflation.
Well, also various religions have taken a position on it, and some of it positive and some of it not. The Chinese had their 2-child policy and they backed away from that.
Yeah, yeah. So
Ian.
Yeah. Yes, population growth was a major issue for global international discussion some decades ago, and I think it was made unacceptable by the opposition from developing countries that tended to say, well, you're talking about our population and not yours. And so it was seen as discriminatory against the lower income countries. So it was taken off the international agenda and was not much spoken about. But nevertheless, I think the world is in fact going towards a situation of stabilizing and declining population. It's forecast that the population of China will stabilize and then begin to decline. And this has certainly been happening for some time already in the case of Japan, because of lower birth rates. The population explosion was driven largely by increases in longevity, but that's now being changed a little bit, I think, by reducing birth rates, and as a country develops, and you see that in the most highly developed countries in the world, their birth rate goes down and it drops below the replacement rate, and I think that's the situation we would have in Canada, were we not to supplement our population by immigration, which, as you've said, is the economy is based on the assumption of growing demand and growing population.
I think the other thing that people don't want to really address, and that is the world of civil unrest due to climate change induced lack of agriculture and water, for example, and that could also spill over into international conflict, and with resulting population corrections that come with war. Anyway, let's move on to Miles. You've been very, very patient, followed by John Holland.
Oh, thank you very much. We live in interesting times. I was in the past hour. I was just in an event, something like this, and I was able to talk with Ralph Nader, of all people, and now I get to ask Ian Burton a question. So I'm in Alberta, and that's important because it doesn't matter what industry I critique. I'm subject to getting into trouble, and I'm particularly interested in industrial agriculture, particularly industrial meat and dairy. So tying in the concepts of stranded assets and shifting from one energy to another, individuals have the opportunity of choice to decide what they're going to buy on their next trip to the grocery store. And my question is, given that I can choose plant-based alternatives for both meat and dairy now, and they're ever growing, and indeed stranded assets, some major dairies, one in particular is either in bankruptcy or out of business in the United States because of the milk alternatives that are proliferating. The choice people have is to shift their energy choice with respect to how they power their bodies. And Julian Cribb, an Australian ecological journalist, he likens the human jawbone to the equivalent threat or greater threat than the nuclear bomb, because 8 billion people being kind of manipulated to think that they need, basically manipulated to think they need to have meat and dairy, is putting tremendous pressure on the resources of the planet. And talk about population growth and in Canada, well, indeed, not too long ago, in the past couple of months, I heard about Alberta saying, oh, we need to bring in more people from other countries because the big corporations like Cargill in their massive meat slaughterhouses need people, and unfortunately they draw on disadvantaged people of the world to work in these places. So the question to you now is, how much did you hear about the topic of people changing their diet, also, and going to plant-based alternatives at COP26?
Practically zero about that or any other.
That's what I heard.
Any other behavioral changes.
And education would also address population, as we just heard from one of our speakers, is a choice. Paul said, oh, I'm going to choose to have 2 children instead of 4. That's another simple choice that individuals can make. But powers that be don't want these very simple individual choices to be widely promoted.
They don't want it, but nevertheless, it's to some degree happening, isn't it? Because the fact that they're there in the market and being produced shows that there must be some demand.
Yeah, let's move on. John Hollins, you had your hand up.
Thank you. Vic suggested we take a leaf out of the book of the Montreal Protocol and have a clearly defined plan. Raymond thinks we have a plan, and he's right to a limited degree. What we have is a pan-Canadian framework from 2016 in which the central pillar is a carbon tax. And I've already talked too much about a carbon tax, so I won't carry on with that. And then in the subsequent years, we've added a grab bag of odds and ends of things that we'll do federally. Doesn't amount to the kind of plan that's needed to tackle such an enormous topic. Just think back to the recent federal election. We sort of had a race to the bottom by 4 political parties which declared their ambition for 2030. The Conservatives got lambasted for sticking with the minus 30% that the Trudeau government had committed to in 2015. Trudeau went for 40 to 45%, the NDP 50%, and the Greens, bless their little green hearts, 60%. Now, you don't need to be you don't need any sophisticated modeling, I suggest, to know that that's just delusional. It's nonsense. Just think of one particular point. Take the 40% of the Liberals. The last time Canada emitted that amount of greenhouse gases was 1971, all right? Half a century ago, when the population was not much more than a half of what it is today. You just need some common sense and elementary arithmetic to figure out that there's no conceivable way that in 9 years, Canada can get to what our government thinks it is claiming. It's just nonsense. So what do we need in terms of reducing emissions? We need a solid plan, which would be informed by some intelligent analysis. For the pandemic, the health people have been leaning quite heavily on some exploratory simulation modeling to know where things may be going. Not always right, but they're much better informed than if they didn't have that. Now, our federal government and none of the provincial governments have the equivalent kind of modeling, which has been available in Canada for 4 decades. Somehow or another, one needs to have a solidly founded plan, which undoubtedly would start with overall reduction in the use for the demand for energy everywhere and anywhere and everywhere, and then the electrification of the sectors that depend on fossil fuel right now, and in the longer run, the role for hydrogen, green hydrogen, for those technologies like heavy transportation, where batteries are not the ideal solution. By the way, Corporate Nights is in the partway through running a series of webinars, and Ralph can speak to that. He's gone away for a little bit, and they began to put together the elements of what it would really take. But what the government of Canada needs to do is take a leaf out of CACOR's book and use a simulation model to understand what is possible, and they need to look out 50 years, not to the next election, and set targets that could be met. There's no possible way that our Canadian governments can meet what the federal government is aiming for right now. So I don't know how you sell some intelligent analysis to our current federal parliament, but without it, we're going to continue bumbling along and continue our 3 decades long record of totally failing any international commitments we make.
Ian, do you want to respond to that? No, okay, Vic Buxton.
Yes, thanks. What I would like to say, and I strongly believe this, is that what has not been done with climate change is to create a plan that was global, that people could buy onto with time. And I'll give you an example of that. When we started negotiating the Montreal Protocol, there were only 30 producing countries and something like 168 non-producing countries. The initial push was then let's simply regulate to some greater degree the phase out amongst these 30 producing countries. And even India, that attended one of the meetings I was chairing, got in and made an announcement that they are not a producer of CFCs, but they intend to be currently and will not become part of that sustained control process. So what we did for 2 years was think about, okay, we got the group of 77 developing countries. They need it. They don't produce it. They buy it. That's preservation of their food supply, chlorofluorocarbons was. So how do we address their problem? Okay, and then we said that in 1980, it was Saving the Ozone Layer Conference in London. I chaired technical negotiations there too, internationally. And basically, that was interesting because what England did, ICI was one of the largest CFC producers in the world. DuPont was second. Okay, and what they did is a lot of their exports, when they were the largest exporter of CFCs in the world. So what they did was they invited their client countries to come and they would pay for 2 people, if providing one of them was the Minister of Environment. That was their plan. That was trade driven, but that's not what I'm alluding to. Dr. Toba and I and a couple of other people met very many times to say, okay, how do we get a global plan to harness everybody and bring them aboard? And we come up with the idea, well, first of all, we're going to have to delay implementation to those countries that are strictly recipients of this chemical and need it and need time to get off it. They're reliable on others, you know? And so we created the idea that we've got to have panels, and the panels have to, we can take, you know, we phased out CFCs in Canada in aerosol uses in 1979, you know, 6 or 7 years before the protocol. But that, you know, that was an easy change, and that people will understand the economics of that are easy change. But we knew right away, we're going to have to give financial support to lesser developed countries. We're going to have to delay implementation. And there's several other things we've got to do. We've got to tighten the controls based on not just international agreement on certain elements, but creating a pathway where people can comply. We even had consortiums form where DuPont and others would share their research into substitute chemicals. None of this, in my view, is going on in the context of climate change, and it needs to. You know, when we signed the Montreal Protocol, it was only a 50% reduction. I was hounded by the press and say, you know, this is a total failure. Look at what you've got in the way of controls. And I said to them, not to be quoted in the paper, I said, look, you have to get them up on the rack before you can tighten the screws. And in this case, we got to get everybody up on the rack somehow within certain timeframes. But the key thing is we got to think through a plan. It's going to require financial assistance. It's going to require the frameworks for the logical detransitioning away from fossil fuels and a number of other things. But we have to, you know, we have to look at this context. Look at the quantity, billions of dollars we spend on developing countries. But it's a planetary problem. Everybody will, you know, was exposed to radiation from the sun in the case of ozone depletion. And we all we're in this together. So any plan we have has to get everybody together in some way, shape, or form. And I could go on and on, but I won't. So anybody who wants to comment on that, please do.
I'll comment that for us to wait around for the governments to meet every year for 26 years at these COPs, and they're trying to appease the corporations, because the corporations, they apparently, maybe Ian can speak to this, but I've heard that it's corporations that held a lot of the tickets into the blue zone, the UN zone, and these corporations are the lobbyists. So they're the ones that are directing what gets written up in these so-called consensus documents. And it's time to make an end run. People need to, in local levels, just say, okay, the leaders are not doing it. We've got to do it for ourselves. That means educating ourselves. That means making our own choices on how we power our homes and making our own choices on what we're eating. And because if we think these few people that go to COPs are going to solve it for us, what we've seen, it's not going to happen.
Okay, I'd like to ask Virginia Hammond to unmute herself and put her video on, because she had an interesting comment in the chat, which I think is pertinent here. Virginia? Oh, she's a little slow in coming up. She might be away. Anyway, her comment was that on NPR yesterday, they had some discussion with the insurance companies. And the comment was, the mere fact that climate change is happening is a wonderful economic opportunity for them to increase their rates and make more money. Which,
I can add a little comment in response to the previous comment that, industry was a big player in the Montreal Protocol too. DuPont stood up at delegation meetings and said there's no substitute, so never be a substitute for CFCs. They made that carte blanche statement in one. And other scientists that were there said, that's bullshit. That's pure bullshit. It's just that we haven't really experimented with other things. And I think what we did then, in trying to answer that, we tried to get consortiums throughout the industry to share research findings, to work together and agree to cooperate in a context of a reasonable time frame to wean off these chemicals. And I don't see any of those exercises underway to make that happen in the context of climate change. And that's absolutely necessary, I think, if we're going to see a realistic solution.
Yeah, but Vic, my understanding is that substitute chemicals were actually more profitable for the DuPonts of the world than the original chemicals, right?
That was only aerosols, nothing more. Okay, remember, they were used in plastics and everything else. And in aerosols, yes, it created a lighter transportable product. And that's why in 1979, we could get rid of CFCs and hairsprays, antiperspirants and deodorant. And the issue, contra argument from DuPont was, well, it's a fire hazard, when we go to some of the substitutes.
Yeah, but for refrigerants and all that, my understanding is their substitute products they cost more, right? So DuPont made more money by eventually agreeing with going with the international consensus, right? What I see was, so I've been looking at and thinking about the Montreal Protocol and why has it been so successful, and why is climate change negotiations and the COPs, and why are those not successful, right? And to me, we have to follow the money. With greenhouse gases, if you look at the Fortune 500 and you look at the top 20 companies there, you'll probably find at least half of them are oil companies of some sort, Exxon and Shell and a whole bunch of others. The hydrocarbon industry is a humongous industry that employs a lot of people, makes a lot of people rich, and they feel threatened by these changes, so they're pushing back. And my understanding is that COP26, the biggest delegation was from the oil and gas industry. Okay, which to me is mind-boggling that they're even allowed to be there. But anyways, but again, to me, it goes back to, we need to have a model, an economic model that will neuter that. Now, earlier I mentioned that there's a bunch of different plans that exist to get to a much cleaner environment and reducing greenhouse gases. But let's just do a small thought experiment here. So let's say that EVs in particular, market share increases dramatically over the next few years, which we're seeing in Europe. We're seeing that in Europe, in China. We're seeing it starting to happen here in some provinces where there's large rebates. We're seeing large adoption of EVs, and we're expecting us at IFCO, we're expecting that by 2030, that most new vehicles purchased in Canada will be electric. Okay, so let's say that happens. And that means that the demand for oil is going to drop. Okay, that means that the most expensive oil in the world, which happens to be tar sands oil, will be the first to become uneconomic. About a third of our Canadian emissions are due to oil and gas production, not the burning of it, but the production of oil and gas. I think someone in Saudi Arabia said in the last couple of days that they expect production of oil to drop 30% in the next decade. Okay, so let's say the production does drop by even 10%. Well, that prices the tar sands out of the market, which means that a large source of emissions in Canada disappears. If we have by then, let's say 30% of our light duty vehicle fleet that's electrified, that's another big chunk of greenhouse gases that disappears. If we made some progress on converting to heat pumps to replace natural gas, that's even more progress. We have already a plan to eliminate all of the remaining coal plants that produce electricity in Canada by 2030, except for one in Alberta that's supposed to be doing carbon capture. To me, that's starting to sound like a realistic path to getting to 45% reduction by 2030. Okay, keep in mind that oil and gas production alone in Canada is about 30% of our emissions.
Can I just reply to your first observations about
Sure.
What's the difference between these two? First of all, the most successful factor for me for the Montreal Protocol as opposed to climate change is there was consequences to everybody for non-compliance. That doesn't exist in the climate. And what were the consequences even for developing countries? That if they bridged any of the controls that we had on what its uses could be or anything else, they were ineligible for financial assistance. Okay, that was the first thing. The second big thing was we ensured them financial assistance so they didn't see a catastrophe loom, all right? And they could also sense they had a logical path forward that they were gonna be able to meet. And on your last point, I was in a meeting with many years ago, and the minister of Saudi Arabia, I was chatting with him. And I said to them, you know, this is a non-renewable resource. Aren't you worried about the fact that somewhere along the line, you're going to run out of oil and that's all your economy's really got? And you know what his reply to me was? Take a look at our investment all over the world. He said, we knew from the onset, the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. Now neither will the oil age. That's always resonated with me. So, you know, these people already have in the backdrop of their mind that things are going to change. And our countries are already getting transition plans with that in mind.
Okay,
Anyway,
that's
I've talked enough, sorry.
okay. We're getting short on time. John Holland, you want to go ahead and
Look, because of the reporting from Vic Buxton, we are all aware that the negotiation of a successful Montreal Protocol was a tough haul. It took many, many years. I've forgotten how many. But let's also remember that the number of vested interests in the ozone depletion were a relatively small number of countries and a relatively small number of major corporations. Global heating is a vastly more difficult issue because it concerns almost everybody in the rich world. And so we shouldn't be surprised that we're having such a tough haul, especially in a country like Canada, where people have to get elected. And I'm on the point, Ian, where despite having been a natural optimist, it's very difficult for me on this issue to be a realistic optimist anymore. And you and I are probably in the same position. we've been talking almost entirely about reducing emissions. I'm prepared to say, as one of our speakers did of some many weeks ago, we're screwed. Let's turn, Ian, if you were going to design, I'm prepared to design a plan that would actually work to reduce emissions along the lines that Raymond and Ralph Torrey have been talking. But how about the more important issue, given the almost certain failure, if not on a Canadian scale, on a global scale, to rein in emissions of greenhouse gases? What would a plan to look after the younger generations of Canadians, given inevitable global heating, how would one start to put together a really substantial working plan to deal with the consequences of what is almost certainly coming? Ian?
I think, John, that's how I originally got drawn into this discussion, because you put to me, what about adaptation, and how do we, what is an adaptation plan or strategy? And we could certainly do a lot more, both to reduce our exposure and our vulnerability, and increasing the exposure and vulnerability. We need a national adaptation plan, as you probably know. There's been one in the works for years and years, and they're still talking about the plan, and there's committees and people working on that. But it seems to be very hard to arrive at the point where they can say, here's a plan, and whether it's federal or provincial and so on and so, and it's very many components. And even if you are thinking about protecting Canadians and the next generations of Canadians, you can't just adapt in one country and not do something, because adaptation is also, although it's classed as a local and national issue, it also has its global ramifications and dimensions. But it is something that needs to be done. People say it is being done very, very slowly. I don't have a blueprint, but I'd sure as hell like to give it a push. So maybe I could ask, would the Club of Rome like to write a document that addresses some of these issues that we've been addressing today? I mean, I must say I'm very impressed by the diversity and the depth and the penetration and the expertise that has been displayed here this afternoon. And I'm wondering if there's some step further that this might be taken that the Club of Rome in Canada would want to do. I could easily say, pick out 5 or 6 people and say, why don't you draft an outline and let's get to work on it.
So being one of the few people in attendance, I'm one of the directors of CACOR. Why don't you send us a proposal, an outline of what you think, and we can discuss it.
Well, I think the other thing that's worth mentioning is that we have had going for some time a pathways project, which in fact is intended to lay out a plan on how to meet particular targets. And if you go on our website at canadiancore.com, on the home page, there's quite a layout in terms of the results of that study. And I think, Ian, if you were to take a look at some of that, you'll see that quite a bit of work has been done so far. And in fact, it's too bad that I'm just taking a quick look that none of the prime authors are on the call now, but indeed, John Hollins was one of the prime authors, and he can certainly, I know he'd be delighted to talk to you about any further details. Anyway, I'd like to try and wind this up now and give the last word to you, Ian. Is there anything you want to say to wind this up?
No, except to say that I've been very much encouraged and enlightened by both the depth and the breadth of the conversation, and the fact that there are so many people in the CACOR community that are prepared to spend time thinking about this. It is one beacon of hope and light and encouragement. And so the suggestion that I talk to John Hollins and whoever else has been writing on these is very welcome, and I will certainly do that. And thank you for inviting my participation.
Okay, I'd like, on behalf of the Canadian Association of the Club of Rome, I'd like to thank you for what I believe turned out to be quite an interesting slight change in our venue and the way we normally address things. And maybe we should try this again. I'll talk to some of the members and see what their feeling were compared the previous way and what we've done here. Of course, if there's still attendees who are not yet members of the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome, do go to our website, canadiancor.com, and in fact, take a look around. There is a membership application directly from there as well. We ask that you look at the Stay Informed box there, which means that once a week you will get an email from us saying what's new on the website. And we do go through a process, and we have for since 2016, where we update it every week. So there is new material constantly coming on board. I'd also like to point out that the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome is a registered Canadian charity. Therefore, there is a tax receipt that people get for membership. And in fact, for those watching on YouTube, that we ask you to become a subscriber to our YouTube channel by clicking on the subscribe button below. And with that, I would like to bring this YouTube to a conclusion. Goodbye, all.